What did family life feel like in ancient Rome before schedules, private rooms, or anything resembling a modern routine? In many Roman homes, life did not happen at specific times of day. It was not organized around appointments or clearly separated phases. It did not begin and end. It existed continuously, layered inside shared space, unfolding through presence rather than planning. A Roman home was not divided into zones with fixed purposes assigned to specific people. It was a lived environment where children, adults, work, rest, noise, and quiet all overlapped. The same spaces held multiple functions across the day. A room might serve as a place of movement in the morning, a place of work in the afternoon, and a place of rest by evening. Family life did not relocate as the day progressed. It stayed in place and changed texture. Children grew up inside this continuity. They did not step into a separate world designed especially for them. They lived inside the same rooms where adults moved, worked, waited, talked, and rested. Their presence was not scheduled into the day. It was assumed. From infancy onward, children were part of the household's rhythm simply by being there. Because of this, family in a Roman home was not a concept that needed definition. It was not an idealized structure or a protected unit set apart from daily life. It was the quiet fact of shared space. People encountered one another not through planned interaction but through proximity. Someone passed through a room, someone sat nearby. Someone worked while someone else rested. Children absorbed this environment long before they understood it. The Roman house did not create moments labeled as family time. There were no clear transitions that gathered everyone together and then released them again. Instead, family life accumulated naturally as people crossed paths, paused in the same spaces, and adjusted their movement around one another. Togetherness was not scheduled, it emerged from overlap. Light played a central role in shaping this experience. As daylight entered courtyards, corridors, and rooms, it revealed people already present, a child sitting on the floor, an adult passing through, someone working near a wall or doorway. Light did not create activity. It made visible what was already happening. Family life unfolded inside this slow illumination. Sound behaved the same way. The house was rarely silent, but it was rarely loud. Footsteps, quiet voices, the movement of objects, the small sounds of children shifting or playing formed a steady acoustic background. These sounds did not announce events, they confirmed continuity. The presence of others was always perceptible, even when no interaction was taking place. Objects within the home carried traces of shared use. A low table, worn smooth by hands. A clay vessel moved from place to place. A stool that served multiple people throughout the day. These objects did not belong exclusively to adults or children. They belonged to the household. Children learned their meaning not through instruction but through repeated exposure. Because space was shared, separation between activities was minimal. Work did not happen in isolation from family life. Domestic tasks unfolded with children nearby, watching, moving, occasionally participating in small ways. Rest did not require withdrawal into a private room. It happened within earshot of others, supported by familiarity rather than solitude. This arrangement shaped how children understood the world. They did not experience life as something segmented into child time and adult time. They experienced it as a continuous flow of actions, pauses, and interactions. Learning happened by watching. Belonging happened by staying close. Security came from repetition rather than from control. The Roman home did not aim to shield children from the rhythms of adult life. It allowed them to witness it. Work, fatigue, waiting, and rest were all visible. Children grew accustomed to the natural rise and fall of energy across the day because they lived inside it, not apart from it. Family life also did not require constant attention to coordination. No one needed to ensure that everyone was doing the same thing at the same moment. A child could play quietly while an adult worked nearby. Someone else might be resting in the same space. These differences did not disrupt the household. They were expected. Because time was not tightly scheduled, interaction did not feel rushed or scarce. A moment of attention did not need to be optimized. Presence could be brief or extended without consequence. This reduced tension. Relationships were not pressed into narrow windows. They expanded naturally where space allowed. Meals, rest, conversation, and play all emerged from this shared environment rather than being imposed upon it. Eating happened when food was available and hunger appeared. Children ate alongside adults or slightly apart without ceremony. No clear boundaries separated nourishment from the rest of the day. It was another layer of shared life. Even discipline and guidance existed within this continuity. Correction did not arrive as a scheduled intervention. It emerged in response to behavior within the same space where everything else occurred. Order was maintained through repetition and expectation rather than constant instruction. Children learned limits by observing how the household moved. The Roman house itself supported this learning. Its structure encouraged visibility and proximity. Courtyards opened into surrounding rooms. Corridors connected spaces without isolating them. Sound and movement traveled easily. No one was entirely hidden. This openness made family life observable without making it performative. Because of this, children were rarely alone in a modern sense, even when no one was directly engaging with them. Presence surrounded them. Someone was always nearby, moving through the same environment. This steady background of human activity provided reassurance without requiring constant interaction. Rest, too, followed this pattern. Children did not withdraw into silence to sleep. They rested within a house that continued to exist around them. Sounds softened, but did not disappear. Movement reduced, but did not stop entirely. Sleep arrived not because the world shut down, but because it became predictable enough to be trusted. This predictability mattered more than quiet. Familiar sounds signaled safety. Repetition created stability. The absence of sharp transitions allowed the body to release alertness gradually. Children learned to rest inside life rather than apart from it. Family life in ancient Rome, then, was not organized around moments designed to create connection. Connection arose naturally from shared space. It did not need to be planned, named, or protected. It existed because people lived together in the same environment, responding to the same conditions. This way of living did not require constant awareness of family as a role or responsibility. It was not something one stepped into or out of. It was simply the background condition of daily life. Children did not need to be integrated into the household. They were born into it and remained within it. As we begin to look more closely at children and family in Roman homes, it helps to set aside modern ideas of scheduling, privacy, and separation. The Roman household did not function by dividing life into compartments. It functioned by allowing life to layer itself inside shared space. To understand family life in ancient Rome, we do not begin with rules or ideals. We begin with the house itself, steady, open, and lived in, and with the simple fact that family was not arranged around time. It unfolded naturally wherever people were already present. The Roman house was not designed as a backdrop for family life. It was family life. Children did not move through it as guests or as occupants of designated areas. They belonged to it fully, inhabiting the same spaces where adults worked, rested, waited, and passed through. From the beginning, the house functioned as a shared world rather than a collection of separate rooms with fixed identities. The atrium or courtyard sat at the center of this world, both physically and experientially. Light entered here first, sound gathered here most clearly, and movement passed through it repeatedly across the day. Children learned this space not as a room meant for them, but as a place where life converged. Adults crossed it carrying objects, pausing briefly, changing direction. Visitors passed through, children followed, lingered, or remained still, absorbing the rhythm without instruction. Corridors and passageways were not transitional zones meant only for movement. They were lived spaces. Children sat along walls, leaned against columns, traced patterns in the floor with their hands or feet. These spaces were neither public nor private in a modern sense. They were simply part of the house's circulation, and children grew familiar with the flow of bodies moving through them. Rooms within the house did not belong permanently to specific functions, and they did not belong exclusively to specific people. A space used for storage might also become a place to sit quietly. A room where work occurred during part of the day might later hold rest or conversation. Children experienced this fluidity early. They did not associate rooms with rules, but with possibilities. Because there was no expectation that children needed a separate environment, there was no clear boundary between adult space and child space. The absence of a child's room was common, especially in modest homes. Children slept, rested, played, and waited in the same areas where adults did the same things at other moments. Privacy, as later understood, was not the organizing principle of domestic life. This created a different sensory experience of space. A room with children did not announce itself as such. There were no bright markers, no dedicated objects meant to signal childhood. Instead, there were subtle traces. A small object shifted from its usual place, a worn edge on a low surface, a basket that had been opened and closed repeatedly. These signs did not disrupt the space. They became part of its texture. The presence of children altered rhythm more than structure. Movement became less linear. Adults adjusted their paths slightly. Pauses appeared where none had been before. Sound layered itself gently. Quiet conversation, footsteps, small movements that did not require attention. The house absorbed these changes without needing to accommodate them explicitly. Children learned the house through repetition rather than explanation. They learned where light gathered in the morning, where shade remained longest, where adults tended to sit, where objects were usually placed. This learning was not formal. It happened because the same patterns repeated day after day. The house revealed itself gradually. Because spaces were multifunctional, children did not associate activity with strict boundaries. Play did not require a designated area. It emerged where there was room, where movement felt possible, where attention was not demanded elsewhere. When adults needed the space, play shifted without resistance. There was no sense of intrusion. Everyone adjusted naturally. This adjustment mattered. It taught children early that space was shared and responsive, not owned or fixed. They learned to read the environment rather than assert control over it. When someone was working nearby, play softened. When the space opened, movement expanded. These changes were not enforced. They were felt. Objects within the house reinforced this understanding. Most items were practical, used by multiple people throughout the day. A stool might support an adult at one moment and a child at another. A low table might hold tools, food, or nothing at all. Children handled these objects without special distinction. They were not given separate sets of things. They learned to exist among what already was. The floor itself became an important surface for children. Stone or tile carried coolness, texture, and sound. Sitting on the floor was normal, not a sign of displacement. Children played close to the ground, where adults' movement passed above them. This vertical layering allowed coexistence without constant interaction. Because movement passed through shared spaces repeatedly, children became accustomed to proximity. People came and went without ceremony. Presence did not require explanation. Someone entering a room did not interrupt. Someone leaving did not signal separation. This continuity reduced anxiety. The environment remained stable even as individuals moved through it. The absence of designated child spaces also meant that children were never fully removed from adult rhythms. Work happened within view. Waiting happened nearby. Fatigue was visible. Rest was observable. Children learned the tempo of life by watching it unfold, rather than by being instructed about it. This did not mean that children were always involved in adult activities. It meant that they were always aware of them. Awareness did not require participation. It required presence. Children could remain near without being addressed, near without being managed. This proximity created familiarity rather than overstimulation. Sound moved freely through the house, and children learned to interpret it. A certain sound indicated movement beginning. Another signaled rest. Voices did not always require response. Silence did not demand attention. The acoustic environment was steady enough that children did not need to react to every change. They learned what mattered by repetition. Because the house did not separate activities sharply, children did not experience abrupt transitions. There was no moment when one space became forbidden and another opened exclusively to them. Instead, availability shifted subtly. A space grew quieter, a surface became free, a path opened. Children followed these cues intuitively. This intuitive movement reduced conflict. Children were not constantly corrected or redirected. They learned boundaries by observing how space behaved. When adults occupied a room more fully, children gravitated elsewhere. When space opened again, they returned. This ebb and flow did not require rules to function. Even rest occurred within shared space. Children did not retreat into isolation to sleep. They rested where the household had already softened. Familiar sounds continued. Movement diminished but did not vanish. Sleep arrived as part of the same environment rather than as an escape from it. Because of this, the house never felt empty or overwhelming. It held people at different levels of activity simultaneously. Children were part of this layering. They did not need to be managed constantly because the environment itself guided behavior. The Roman house, then, was not a container divided by age or role. It was a continuous world where children grew up inside adult life rather than alongside it. Space did not instruct children where they belonged. It assumed their presence and adapted around it. This shared world shaped children not by design but by exposure. They learned how life moved because they lived inside its movement. They learned where to sit, where to wait, where to move, not because they were told, but because the house revealed these patterns repeatedly. As we continue, it becomes clear that this shared spatial experience did more than accommodate children. It shaped how family functioned at every level. The house did not organize family life by separating its members. It organized it by allowing them to remain together, moving through the same spaces at different speeds without needing to be synchronized or managed. From this foundation, we can begin to understand how children learned behavior, responsibility, and belonging, not through instruction or scheduling, but through continuous presence within a shared domestic world. From this shared domestic world, early childhood did not emerge as a separate phase that required special containment. Infants entered life already inside proximity. From the beginning, care was organized around closeness rather than separation. The house did not create distance in order to manage children. It reduced distance so that care could happen continuously, without interruption. Infants were not placed apart from daily life. They were carried through it. Bodies stayed close, often pressed against the chest, the hip, or the shoulder. Movement did not pause for childcare. Care moved with the body as it continued its ordinary paths through the house. A person carrying an infant crossed the same courtyard, passed through the same corridor, paused in the same shaded areas as anyone else. The child did not need a dedicated place. The adult's body became the place. This closeness shaped the earliest experience of safety. Infants were surrounded by familiar movement, familiar warmth, familiar sound. There was no sharp contrast between being cared for and being present. Care was presence. The child learned the house not as space, but as rhythm, motion, stillness, repetition. Because infants were held so often, their orientation to the world began through sensation rather than vision. They felt the shift of weight as someone stood or sat. They felt warmth change as bodies moved closer to light or shade. They heard sound change subtly as the environment changed, not as sudden signals, but as texture. Crying existed within this texture, not as an event that had to reorganize the household, but as one sound among many. It did not need to be silenced instantly to restore order. It needed to be answered with proximity. An infant's cry brought a body closer, not a system into motion. The response was physical before it was verbal. Low voices accompanied care. Words were spoken, but not performed. There was no expectation that infants needed constant verbal stimulation or explanation. Speech emerged naturally from presence. A voice was heard because someone was nearby, not because someone was trying to teach or calm through technique. Small sounds filled the space quietly. The rustle of cloth as an infant shifted, the soft contact of skin against skin, the sound of breath adjusting. These sounds did not dominate the house, they blended into it. Adults did not need silence in order to care, and infants did not require silence in order to rest. Sleep, especially in early childhood, was not isolated. Infants slept near others, often within the same room or space where adults continued to move gently. Sleep did not require the absence of life, it required predictability. Familiar sound, familiar temperature, familiar presence allowed rest to arrive without effort. Because sleep occurred near others, waking did not feel like interruption. An infant might wake briefly, shift, vocalize, then settle again as movement and sound continued around them. There was no expectation of uninterrupted rest measured against an ideal. Sleep was fluid, responsive, and forgiving. Early childhood care relied on repetition rather than precision. The same actions happened again and again, lifting, holding, adjusting, setting down, picking up. There was no sense of optimization. Care unfolded at the pace the child required, without needing to be scheduled into blocks of time. This repetition built familiarity. Infants learned that the world responded consistently, even if not immediately. They learned that presence returned, that closeness followed discomfort, that the environment did not vanish when attention shifted elsewhere. This consistency mattered more than timing. Because care happened within shared space, infants also absorbed the rhythms of adult life without being asked to participate. They were present during work, waiting, rest, and movement. They were not shielded from these activities, nor were they involved deliberately. They simply existed within them. This existence shaped early awareness. Infants learned that life had texture rather than structure. There was no sharp beginning or ending to activity. Things happened, slowed, resumed. Care was part of this flow, not a separate operation. As infants grew into early childhood, this closeness did not disappear abruptly. It loosened gradually. Children were set down more often, allowed to move slightly away, then return. Distance increased, but it remained elastic. Separation was temporary, not enforced. Early childhood did not require independence to be declared or trained. Independence emerged as a byproduct of familiarity. A child who had always been close did not fear moving slightly farther away. The environment was known, presence was reliable. Small children remained within sight and sound. They were not constantly monitored. They did not need to be. The house itself provided boundaries. Walls, columns, and familiar paths limited movement gently. Children explored within these limits without needing constant correction. Sound continued to play an important role. Adults learned to recognize small shifts in sound that indicated movement, discomfort, or curiosity. Children learned which sounds required response and which did not. This mutual attunement reduced urgency. Not every sound demanded immediate action. Crying, when it occurred, was not interpreted as failure. It was information. It signaled need, discomfort, or transition. The response remained physical and relational. Someone moved closer, the environment adjusted slightly. Care resumed without drama. Early childhood care did not isolate the child from frustration or discomfort entirely. Small discomforts occurred and passed. The presence of others made these moments manageable rather than overwhelming. The child did not face them alone. Because there was no strict separation between caregiving and living, adults did not experience childcare as an interruption of life. It was life. Carrying, holding, responding happened alongside other activities, not instead of them. This reduced tension. There was no need to switch roles abruptly. This integration mattered for calm. When care does not compete with other responsibilities, it does not need to be rushed. There was no countdown to return to something else. Care lasted as long as it was needed. Early childhood was therefore shaped less by instruction and more by environment. Children learned how to be in space by being held within it. They learned how sound behaved by hearing it continue. They learned how rest arrived by watching bodies slow. Objects within reach were simple. Children handled what already existed rather than being given specialized items. Texture mattered more than novelty. Stone, wood, fabric. These materials repeated across the house and became familiar. This familiarity reduced overstimulation. Children were not surrounded by rapidly changing inputs. The environment remained stable enough that attention could settle. Curiosity unfolded slowly rather than being pulled in multiple directions. Because of this stability, adults did not need to manage early childhood through constant engagement. Presence was enough. The child remained occupied by the environment itself, its sounds, its surfaces, its movement. Early childhood was therefore not defined by milestones marked against time. It was defined by gradual change within continuity. The child changed because the world remained steady. Growth occurred inside repetition. This approach did not require theory or technique. It relied on closeness, observation, and adjustment. Adults adapted to the child as much as the child adapted to the environment. There was no expectation of control, there was only response. As children grew more mobile, they did not leave this system behind. They carried it forward. Closeness remained available even as distance increased. Care remained relational rather than procedural. In this way, early childhood in Roman homes was not managed by isolation or strict regulation. It was held within shared life. Infants were not separated to be cared for. They were cared for because they were not separated. This foundation of closeness shaped everything that followed. It established trust without requiring explanation. It allowed calm to develop without being enforced. And it prepared children to move outward into the shared world of the house with confidence rather than anxiety. From here, we can begin to see how children did not simply occupy space within the household, but gradually learned how to participate in it through presence, imitation, and shared rhythm, long before responsibility or instruction entered the picture. From this foundation of closeness and trust, play did not emerge as a separate domain that needed to be created or supervised. It appeared naturally woven into the same spaces where care, work, and rest already existed. Children did not step away from daily life in order to play, they played inside it. In Roman homes, play was not organized around objects designed for amusement. It was shaped by what the house already offered. Space itself became material, light moving across stone, shadows stretching and shrinking, cool surfaces warming slowly. Small changes in the environment created endless variation without requiring new things to be introduced. Children learned early that the house was not static. It changed throughout the day, even though its structure remained the same. A courtyard felt different in the morning than in the afternoon. A corridor that was dim became bright, then dim again. These changes invited attention. Play often began with noticing rather than with intention. Light was one of the most common companions in play. A patch of sunlight on the floor became something to step into, then out of, then back into again. Shadows cast by columns or doorframes became boundaries to cross, shapes to trace, places to hide hands or feet. Nothing needed to be explained. The movement of light provided its own logic. Water, when present, offered another source of quiet engagement. A basin, a trickle, a vessel being filled or emptied created sound and motion that invited curiosity. Children watched ripples form and disappear. Fingers disturbed the surface and withdrew again. These actions were not framed as play, but they functioned as such. Small objects already in use around the house became temporary companions. A smooth stone picked up and set down, a length of cord or twine tied, untied, dragged across the floor. A piece of cloth folded, unfolded, gathered, released. These items were not owned by the child in any formal sense. They passed through small hands briefly and then returned to the household flow. Because objects were shared and limited, play did not accumulate possessions. It accumulated experience. A child did not expect to keep something. Engagement ended when interest faded or when the object was needed elsewhere. This impermanence did not frustrate play, it defined it. Play emerged in short stretches between other moments. A child moved, paused, engaged, then drifted back into stillness or observation. There was no expectation that play should last a certain amount of time or achieve a particular outcome. It began and ended quietly, often without being noticed by others. This lack of scheduling mattered. When play is not planned, it does not need to be sustained artificially. It rises and falls with energy, attention, and environment. Children played when conditions invited it and stopped when they no longer did. Because play did not require adult orchestration, adults did not need to manage it constantly. They remained nearby, aware without being directive. The house itself provided limits. Walls, thresholds, and familiar paths guided movement without instruction. Safety was imperfect by modern standards, but it was stable. Children knew where they were allowed to move because those spaces were consistently used. A courtyard was always a courtyard. A corridor always led somewhere familiar. Risk existed, but it was predictable rather than sudden. This predictability reduced anxiety. Children were not constantly surprised by new rules or rearranged spaces. The environment did not change dramatically from one day to the next. Because of this, children learned to navigate it with confidence rather than caution. Play often involved imitation, but not as performance. Children watched adults handle objects, move through space, pause, resume. Later, they repeated fragments of these actions in their own way. A child might carry something briefly, set it down, walk a familiar path, then abandon the action entirely. These repetitions were not rehearsals for future roles. They were ways of understanding movement and sequence. The child learned how actions fit together, not because someone explained it, but because the environment made it visible. Sound also shaped play. The echo of footsteps in a corridor. The dull thud of something dropped. The soft scrape of stone against stone. These sounds did not signal success or failure. They simply responded. Children learned through listening as much as through touching. Because sound was familiar and continuous, It did not overstimulate. The house did not suddenly become loud or silent. This consistency allowed children to remain engaged without becoming overwhelmed. Attention could stay focused on simple interactions. Play rarely required privacy. Children played where others were present. Adults moved through the same spaces. Conversation, work, and waiting continued nearby. This coexistence did not interrupt play, it grounded it. The presence of others provided subtle regulation. Children did not need constant correction. They adjusted naturally to movement around them. If space became busy, play shifted or paused. If space opened again, it resumed. Because play was not isolated, it did not escalate into intensity that required intervention. There was no separate play zone where behavior needed to be monitored differently. Play remained proportionate to the environment. Imagination did not require elaborate props. A shadow became something to follow. A line in the floor suggested a boundary. A corner offered temporary retreat. These elements did not carry narrative in a modern sense, they carried sensation. This kind of play was repetitive, but not boring. The same actions were performed again and again, but conditions changed slightly each time. Light moved, temperature shifted, sound altered subtly. These variations kept engagement alive. Children did not need novelty delivered to them. The environment provided enough change on its own. Because of this, attention deepened rather than scattered. Play became slower, quieter, more observational. The rhythm of play mirrored the rhythm of the household. Activity rose and fell. Movement followed stillness. Nothing demanded constant stimulation. When play ended, there was no sense of loss. Another moment would come. Importantly, play did not need to be productive. It was not evaluated. There were no expectations of learning outcomes or developmental milestones being met in a visible way. Growth occurred, but it was not measured. This lack of evaluation allowed play to remain relaxed. Children were not watched for performance. They were watched for safety and presence. This difference mattered deeply for calm. When a child stopped playing and simply observed, that was not seen as disengagement. Observation was part of participation. Watching light move or adults work was itself a form of engagement. Because play was embedded in shared space, it did not conflict with adult activity. A child did not interrupt work by playing. Play adapted to work rather than competing with it. Adults accepted this overlap. There was no expectation that children should be constantly occupied or distracted. Stillness was allowed, waiting was normal. This tolerance extended to minor disruptions, a dropped object, a sudden movement, a brief cry. These moments were absorbed by the environment without escalation. The house did not reset because play changed. As children grew older, play became more mobile. They moved through the house more confidently, exploring familiar paths more fully. But the nature of play remained the same. It continued to arise from the environment rather than being imposed upon it. Even outside the house, play followed similar patterns. Streets, thresholds, and open spaces offered textures and movement rather than designated play areas. Children learned where they could go by watching where others went. There was no sharp line between play and learning. Children learned because they played, and they played because they were present. The environment taught without instruction. This form of play did not require constant novelty or adult validation. It required stability. The same house, the same paths, the same objects returning to the same places allowed play to remain open-ended without becoming chaotic. Because of this, children learned restraint naturally. They understood limits because those limits were consistent. They did not test boundaries constantly because boundaries did not shift unpredictably. Play also did not need to be safe in an absolute sense. It needed to be familiar. Children knew what to expect from the environment. That knowledge reduced risk more effectively than rules. This familiarity allowed confidence to grow without bravado. Children moved carefully, not because they were afraid, but because they understood the space. They knew where surfaces were uneven, where shadows hid steps, where water collected. The house taught these lessons quietly, through repetition rather than correction. In this way, play was not a separate activity layered onto childhood. It was a natural expression of being present in a shared domestic world. It required no planning, no equipment, and no explanation. From here, we can begin to see how play prepared children not for entertainment, but for participation. Through repeated engagement with space, objects, and rhythm, children learned how to exist within the household without needing constant direction. This quiet, improvised play did not stand apart from family life. It flowed through it, shaping attention, patience, and familiarity, qualities that would later support responsibility, cooperation, and belonging without needing to be taught explicitly. From this quiet continuity between play and presence, learning did not arrive as a separate phase or formal activity. It emerged naturally from proximity. Children learned because they were near work, not because work was transformed into a lesson. In Roman homes, daily labor was not hidden from children or postponed until they were elsewhere. Cleaning, preparing food, repairing objects, organizing space. These actions unfolded openly in the same rooms where children moved, played, waited, and rested. Work did not require privacy. It required space, light, and repetition, all of which were already shared. Because of this openness, children grew up surrounded by the visible rhythms of adult activity. They saw hands moving across familiar surfaces. They heard tools used in consistent ways. They watched objects being picked up, adjusted, set aside, and returned again. None of this was explained step by step. Explanation was unnecessary when pattern was constant. Learning did not begin with instruction, it began with attention. Children watched because work happened in front of them. They listened because sound carried information. They absorbed sequence, timing, and effort simply by being present while tasks unfolded. This kind of learning was gradual and cumulative. No single moment carried significance. There was no point at which a child was suddenly taught how to do something. Instead, understanding formed slowly through repeated exposure to the same actions performed in slightly different ways. Cleaning, for example, did not appear as a chore with a defined beginning and end. It appeared as ongoing maintenance. A surface was wiped, something spilled and was removed, dust accumulated and was brushed away. Children saw these actions happen without ceremony. Over time, they understood that spaces required care, not because they were told, but because care was visibly necessary. Food preparation worked the same way. Ingredients were handled openly, tools were used consistently. Heat was managed carefully. Children observed waiting as part of the process. Nothing happened instantly. The sequence of preparation revealed itself through repetition rather than instruction. Because food was prepared regularly and visibly, children learned its rhythms early. They learned that some steps required patience, others required attention. They saw that mistakes were corrected quietly. Nothing dramatic followed a spill or delay. This taught tolerance without words. Repairs and small adjustments offered similar lessons. When something broke or loosened, it was addressed within the same space. A tool was retrieved, a piece was fitted back into place. Children watched hands work slowly, sometimes unsuccessfully at first, then successfully. They learned that effort did not guarantee immediate results. This exposure taught persistence without pressure. There was no expectation that children should perform these tasks themselves immediately. Observation came first. Imitation followed naturally, often much later, and often incompletely. Children began to copy small fragments of what they had seen, a gesture, a movement, the way an object was held. These imitations were not corrected aggressively. Adults understood them as part of learning, not as errors. Because imitation was informal, it did not require approval. A child might attempt to sweep briefly, then abandon the action. The attempt itself mattered more than completion. No one insisted that the child finish or improve. The environment allowed repetition over time. Learning through watching also meant learning through waiting. Children saw that not all actions happened immediately. Some required conditions to change. Light needed to be right. Materials needed to be ready. Someone else needed to finish first. This taught patience without instruction. Importantly, this form of learning did not isolate children from adult responsibility. It introduced responsibility gradually without announcing it. A child might be asked to hold something briefly, later to carry it a short distance, much later to perform the task independently. These invitations were situational, not scheduled. They arose because help was needed in that moment, not because it was time to teach. This prevented learning from becoming abstract. Skills were acquired because they were useful, not because they were assigned. Children also learned by watching what adults did not do. They observed restraint. They saw when adults chose not to act immediately. They noticed when work paused because conditions were unsuitable. These moments taught judgment rather than technique. Because work was visible, its limits were visible as well. Children learned that effort had boundaries. Fatigue appeared. Tools were set aside. Tasks stopped when enough had been done. This taught moderation without explanation. Learning by watching also included emotional regulation. Children saw how adults responded to difficulty. A problem was addressed calmly or set aside temporarily. Frustration did not dominate the space. Voices remained steady. Movement slowed rather than accelerated. This modeled response taught children how to remain composed without being instructed to do so. Calm was not demanded, it was demonstrated. Because work and learning shared the same environment, there was no sharp division between child time and adult time. Children were not removed from adult activity in order to be protected from it. They were protected by familiarity. This familiarity reduced fear. Tools were not mysterious. Heat was not unknown. Objects were handled openly. Children learned what required care because they saw care being taken. Sound played an important role in this learning. The repeated sounds of work, scraping, tapping, pouring, became signals. Children learned what was happening without looking. Sound oriented them within the household. Because these sounds were consistent, they did not overwhelm. They provided information without demanding attention. Children could remain engaged without becoming overstimulated. Learning by watching also meant learning at different speeds. Each child absorbed what they were ready to absorb. There was no standardized pace. Comparison was unnecessary. The environment did not require uniform progress. Older children naturally noticed more detail. Younger children absorbed rhythm. Both forms of learning were valid and sufficient. The household did not accelerate development artificially. Because learning was embedded in daily life, it did not feel like effort. Children were not evaluated. No one tracked progress explicitly. Skills emerged quietly, often unnoticed, until they were suddenly present. This lack of evaluation prevented anxiety. Children did not fear making mistakes. Errors were part of observation. Nothing catastrophic followed a misstep. The environment remained stable. Learning through proximity also reinforced belonging. Children were not separate observers. They were participants in waiting. Their presence mattered even before their contribution did. Adults did not perform work for children's benefit. They performed work because it needed to be done. Learning occurred as a byproduct of necessity rather than intention. This distinction mattered. When learning is not the primary goal, It does not dominate the experience. Attention remains on the task itself. Children learned because life required it, not because someone planned it. As children grew, their proximity to work changed subtly. They stood closer, they handled objects longer, they were trusted with small responsibilities. These changes were not announced, they unfolded naturally. Because the house remained the same, children could map their learning onto familiar space. They knew where things were stored, they knew where work usually happened. This spatial knowledge supported competence. Learning did not depend on verbal instruction, it depended on repetition and presence. Words were used when necessary, but they were not the primary vehicle of teaching. This allowed learning to remain accessible to all children, regardless of temperament. Quiet children learned as much as active ones. Observation did not require confidence or performance. Importantly, learning by watching did not eliminate play. Play and learning overlapped. A child might imitate a task playfully before performing it seriously much later. These early imitations were rehearsals without pressure. Because play had already taught children how to engage with space and objects, learning through watching felt familiar. It extended existing patterns rather than introducing new ones. This continuity meant that responsibility did not arrive suddenly, it accumulated gradually. By the time children were expected to contribute meaningfully, they already understood the environment well. They knew how work moved through the day. They understood when effort increased and when it eased. They recognized the signs of completion. All of this knowledge came from watching, not from instruction. Learning, in this sense, was not separate from living. It was living. Children learned because they were present in a world that repeated itself steadily enough to be understood. This form of learning did not aim to produce independence quickly. It aimed to produce familiarity. Independence emerged later as a natural consequence of knowing how the household functioned. Because of this, children did not feel rushed into competence. They grew into it. The environment made space for gradual readiness. In Roman homes, learning by watching allowed children to absorb not only skills, but attitudes. They learned patience, tolerance, and restraint simply by sharing space with work that unfolded at a human pace. This quiet education did not need formal structure. It relied on stability, repetition, and shared presence. And because it did, it supported belonging before responsibility, understanding before performance, and participation before instruction. From here, we can begin to see how children's gradual participation in household life prepared them for responsibility, not as an obligation imposed from outside, but as a natural extension of familiarity and presence within the shared domestic world. From this gradual movement toward participation, food entered family life in much the same way as work and learning had, without rigid structure, without strict timing, and without being separated into a special category of activity. Eating was not an event that interrupted the day, it was something that flowed through it, responding to hunger, availability, and shared presence rather than to a fixed schedule. In Roman homes, meals did not organize the day around themselves. They appeared when conditions allowed and when the body asked for them. Children learned this rhythm early, not through instruction, but through experience. Hunger was recognized as a signal, not something to be delayed until a specific hour. Food responded to need rather than anticipation. This meant that eating was often irregular. Small portions were shared at different times. Someone might eat while another worked nearby. A child might receive a piece of bread or fruit without it being labeled a meal. Food moved through the household quietly, without ceremony. Because of this informality, food felt social without being performative. Eating did not require everyone to stop at once. It did not demand alignment. It simply happened wherever people already were, folding into existing activity rather than replacing it. Children grew up inside this rhythm. They learned that hunger did not require urgency or anxiety. It did not mean something was wrong. It meant the body was ready to receive nourishment. When food was available, it was shared. When it was not, waiting was normal. This waiting did not feel like deprivation. Children had already learned patience through watching work and play unfold slowly. Hunger was one more condition that passed. The household did not react sharply to it. This calm response shaped how children understood need. Food itself was simple: bread, olives, small portions of cheese, grains prepared earlier, fruit when available. These items were familiar, their smells carried through the house quietly. Children learned to associate these scents with comfort rather than excitement. Containers mattered here. Clay bowls, simple plates, small jars, objects that were used repeatedly and handled openly. Children saw food being taken from storage, portioned, returned. Nothing was hidden, nothing was excessive. The sounds of eating were understated. The tear of bread, the scrape of a bowl, the low murmur of voices. These sounds did not dominate the space. They blended with other household noise, reinforcing the sense that eating belonged within ordinary life. Because meals were not strictly defined, children did not experience strong boundaries between eating and not eating. A bite could happen, then play could resume. Food did not require a pause in presence. It supported continuity rather than interruption. This continuity mattered. When eating does not demand full attention or performance, it does not become charged. Children did not need to behave differently at meals. They were already inside shared space. Their behavior adjusted naturally. Sharing food taught cooperation without instruction. Portions were small. Taking too much was visible. Children learned to notice others by watching what remained. Sharing was not moralized, it was practical. Because food was limited, waste was noticeable. Children saw what happened when something was dropped or spoiled. These moments were handled calmly. Nothing dramatic followed. This taught care without fear. Children also learned flexibility. If food was delayed, life continued. If food arrived earlier than expected, it was welcomed. There was no ideal time against which reality was measured. This prevented frustration. Eating often happened near work. Someone might eat while standing nearby. Someone else might continue a task. This overlap reinforced the idea that nourishment supported activity rather than replacing it. For children, this meant that eating did not signal rest or reward. It was maintenance. It allowed movement to continue. This reduced emotional intensity around food. Smell played a strong role. Warm grain, oil, smoke from cooking fires. These scents drifted through the house and courtyard, announcing food quietly without demanding response. Children learned to recognize readiness through scent rather than through instruction. This sensory awareness made food predictable. Even without knowing when something would be ready, children knew what it meant when smells changed. Anticipation formed gently without urgency. Children also learned that food preparation took time. Watching adults wait for heat, stir slowly, return later, reinforced patience. Eating was connected to process, not immediacy. Because eating was shared but not synchronized, children learned independence within togetherness. They ate when hungry, not when everyone else did. Yet they were never isolated. Someone was always nearby. This prevented eating from becoming a solitary or monitored act. Children were not observed closely or corrected constantly. They learned how to eat by watching others, just as they learned everything else. Over time, children understood which foods were everyday and which were occasional. This distinction did not require explanation. It was revealed through repetition. Ordinary food appeared often, other foods appeared rarely. Because food was not abundant, gratitude did not need to be taught explicitly. Children learned appreciation through familiarity and absence. When something was present, it mattered. Eating also taught children about pacing. Food was not consumed quickly. bites were small. Eating blended with conversation or silence. This prevented urgency. The household did not demand that children finish everything immediately. Hunger fluctuated, portions were adjusted, nothing rigid was enforced. This flexibility supported trust. Children trusted that food would return. Adults trusted children to respond to their bodies. This mutual trust reduced conflict. Meals did not mark transitions sharply. Eating did not signal the end of work or the beginning of rest. It was one thread among many. Because of this, children did not associate food with reward or control. It was part of shared life, not a tool. Food also created moments of quiet connection, sitting nearby, passing a bowl. These small gestures reinforced belonging without requiring conversation. Children learned to wait their turn without being told. They watched how food moved. They followed patterns. Over time, these patterns became internal. Children understood how hunger, availability, and sharing interacted. No rules were necessary. This approach did not romanticize scarcity. It normalized rhythm. Eating happened when it could. The body adapted. Importantly, this did not mean children were neglected. Care was present, but it was woven into routine rather than isolated into special moments. The simplicity of food allowed attention to remain broad. Eating did not dominate thought. It supported life quietly. As children grew, they participated more directly, carrying a bowl, helping distribute. These actions emerged naturally. Because food had never been separated from life, participation did not feel like a new responsibility. It felt familiar. Meals, in this sense, reinforced everything children had already learned: patience, observation, sharing, and trust. Eating did not interrupt family life, it expressed it. Food moved through the household the same way people did, steadily, quietly, without needing to be scheduled. From here, we can begin to see how nourishment, like work and play, supported children's sense of belonging, not through rules or timing, but through repetition and shared presence. Food was not something that organized family life. It was something family life carried naturally within it. From this quiet familiarity with sharing and participation, order emerged naturally within the Roman household. Discipline did not arrive as a separate system imposed on children. It grew out of the same repetition that shaped eating, work, and play. Order was not enforced constantly because it did not need to be. The house itself, through its routines and shared use, taught what was acceptable by showing it again and again. In Roman homes, behavior was guided less by explicit rules and more by rhythm. Children learned where movement was allowed, where stillness was expected, and where care was required simply by observing how the household functioned. When an action disrupted the flow of shared space, it became noticeable immediately, not because someone pointed it out, but because it stood out against what usually happened. Correction, when it occurred, was often quiet and direct. A hand gently redirected. An object returned to its place. A word spoken softly but firmly. These moments were brief. They did not stop the day, they adjusted it. Children learned that boundaries existed not to control them, but to keep the household moving smoothly. Because space was shared, disorder affected everyone. A blocked passageway, an object left where it interfered with work, excessive noise in a moment of rest. Children saw the consequences of their actions immediately, not as punishment, but as disruption. This visibility made correction practical rather than moral. Adults did not need to explain these corrections at length. Explanation was rarely necessary. The environment itself reinforced the lesson. The same path was used every day. The same surfaces were needed repeatedly. When something interfered, it was corrected simply because it had to be. This repetition created predictability. Children came to expect certain responses. If they ran where others needed to pass, movement was slowed and redirected. If they handled objects roughly, those objects were taken away briefly or repositioned. Nothing dramatic followed. Life continued. Small duties entered naturally, carrying something light, holding an object steady, clearing a space after use. These tasks were not framed as obligations. They were framed as participation. Children did not perform them to earn approval. They performed them because they were already present when something needed to be done. These small responsibilities were not constant. They appeared when appropriate and disappeared when not needed. This prevented fatigue and resentment. Children learned that contribution was situational, not continuous. Because discipline was embedded in routine, it did not feel personal. A correction was not a judgment of character. It was a response to a moment. Once the moment passed, the correction passed with it. There was no lingering tension. Tone mattered deeply. Voices remained steady. Movements remained calm. Raised voices were rare because urgency was rare. The household did not operate under constant pressure. Without strict schedules to meet, there was room to adjust rather than escalate. Children learned restraint not through fear, but through familiarity. They saw adults pause, they saw patience modeled repeatedly. Waiting, already common, extended into behavior. Children learned to wait for their turn, for space, for attention, because waiting was already part of life. Limits were clear because they were consistent. Certain actions were always redirected. Certain areas were always treated with care. Children did not test boundaries endlessly because boundaries did not shift unpredictably. This consistency supported calm. When expectations do not change suddenly, the nervous system relaxes. Children did not need to stay alert for unpredictable reactions. They learned what to expect by watching what happened repeatedly. Importantly, discipline did not isolate children from the household. A correction did not remove them from shared space. They remained present, adjusting behavior while staying included. This preserved belonging even during correction. Order also came from imitation. Children mirrored how adults handled objects, moved through space, and interacted with others. When adults treated the environment with care, children followed. When adults paused, children paused. Because the household moved at a human pace, there was time for adjustment. Mistakes were expected, spills were cleaned, objects were repaired or replaced. Children learned that error did not end participation. This approach did not eliminate conflict, but it softened it. Frustration was addressed early before it escalated. Small corrections prevented larger disruptions. The shared nature of space required awareness of others. Children learned to notice who was resting, who was working, who was carrying something fragile. This awareness became habitual. It did not require reminders. Quiet discipline also shaped emotional regulation. Children learned to modulate their energy by observing the household state. When activity was high, energy rose. When activity softened, children adjusted without being told. Because the house did not demand constant performance, children were not pressured to behave perfectly. They were allowed to learn gradually through repetition rather than instruction. Order was maintained through flow. When flow was interrupted, it was restored gently. There was no need to assign blame. The focus remained on restoring balance. This balance was physical as much as social. Objects returned to place. Pathways cleared. Sounds softened. Children learned that order was something felt, not something imposed. Because discipline was quiet, it did not dominate memory. Children remembered the household as stable rather than strict. Boundaries existed, but they did not overshadow daily life. Small rituals reinforced order without formalization. Washing hands before touching food. Setting objects down carefully. Closing doors softly. These actions were repeated so often they became automatic. Children learned that care for the environment was care for others. When space functioned well, everyone benefited. This understanding did not require explanation, it was experienced. Even correction itself was brief. Once behavior adjusted, attention moved on. There was no lingering focus on what had gone wrong. The household did not dwell on mistakes. This allowed children to recover quickly. There was no shame to carry forward. The day continued uninterrupted. Because order was maintained through repetition, it did not require constant enforcement. Adults did not need to watch children closely at all times. Trust developed naturally. Children were given room to test limits safely. The environment itself provided feedback. Hard surfaces, fragile objects, shared pathways, all taught caution through experience. This environment did not aim to eliminate risk completely. It aimed to make risk understandable. Children learned where to be careful by encountering consequences that were manageable. Discipline then was not a system layered onto family life. It was one of its quiet functions. It existed to support flow, not to assert authority. This approach created a household atmosphere that was calm but not rigid, structured but not controlled. Children knew what was expected because expectations were visible, not because they were announced. As children grew older, these patterns held. Responsibility expanded naturally. Larger tasks replaced smaller ones. The same principles applied. Because discipline had never been separated from daily life, increased responsibility did not feel like a sudden burden. It felt like a continuation. The household remained the teacher, repetition remained the method, presence remained the foundation. From here, we can begin to see how this quiet order supported not only behavior, but emotional security. Children did not need constant reassurance because the environment itself was reliable. This reliability allowed children to relax into the household rather than resist it. Order did not restrict them, it held them. In this way, discipline in Roman homes did not stand apart as control. It existed as continuity. The same forces that shaped eating, work, and play also shaped behavior. Order emerged because life repeated itself calmly, day after day, within shared space that everyone learned to inhabit together. From this steady sense of being held by routine and repetition, evening emerged naturally within the Roman family house. It did not arrive as a planned gathering or a designated moment of togetherness. There was no signal that announced family time. Instead, evening gathered people slowly through the same processes that had shaped the entire day: effort easing, movement slowing, and attention turning inward without instruction. As daylight weakened, the household did not change suddenly. Tasks were completed one by one, not replaced by new ones. Tools were set aside, surfaces were cleared gradually. The spaces that had been active throughout the day became quieter, not because silence was required, but because there was simply less that needed doing. Children remained present through these changes, absorbing them without needing explanation. Evening did not call everyone into the same place at once. It allowed people to drift closer together naturally. Someone sat rather than stood. Someone leaned against a wall instead of crossing the room. Movement shortened. Distances between people reduced without being planned. The household contracted gently, the way light did. Lamplight appeared not as a dramatic replacement for daylight, but as a soft extension of it. A small flame was lit when shadows became inconvenient, not when darkness officially began. Light remained localized. It did not flood the house. It gathered around where people were already present. This concentration of light also concentrated attention, drawing people nearer without commanding them. Children responded immediately to this change. Their energy adjusted without being directed. Running slowed into walking. Voices softened. Play became quieter and more contained. No one announced that it was time to calm down. Calm arrived because the environment invited it. Evening sounds reflected this shift. Footsteps became fewer and slower. Objects were moved carefully, placed rather than dropped. Voices lowered naturally, not out of rule, but because proximity increased. When people are closer together, sound does not need to travel as far. There was no clear division between daytime activity and evening rest. One blended into the other. A child might sit near an adult working on a small task, watching without participating. Another might lie nearby, attention drifting in and out. These states were not managed, they were allowed, because there was no expectation that children remain awake until a certain hour. There was no pressure to keep them engaged or entertained. Fatigue was not resisted. When a child's body began to slow, nothing intervened to keep it alert. Sleep was not scheduled, it was permitted. Children fell asleep where it made sense, on a bench, on a mat, near a familiar adult. Sleep did not require isolation, it required stability. Familiar sounds continued, familiar movements persisted. The world did not stop to accommodate sleep. Sleep arrived because the world had become gentle enough to allow it. This mattered deeply. When sleep is not treated as an event that must be initiated, it does not create tension. Children did not need to be persuaded or instructed to sleep. Their bodies recognized when effort was no longer necessary. Rest followed naturally. Even waking during the evening or night did not disrupt this pattern. A child might stir briefly, hear familiar sounds, and settle again. There was no clock to confirm interruption, no urgency to return to sleep. Wakefulness was simply another passing state. Adults did not withdraw from children during evening. They remained present, though less active. Conversation continued quietly. Simple tasks might still be completed by lamplight. The household did not switch modes, it softened. Because evening did not demand togetherness, togetherness emerged freely. People found themselves near one another without arranging it. Children clustered near warmth and light. Adults sat where they could rest while remaining aware of the space. This proximity did not require interaction. Silence was comfortable. Presence was enough. Family life did not need to be expressed through conversation or shared activities. It was expressed through co-presence. Objects reflected this transition as well. Toys or improvised play objects were set aside gradually. No one announced cleanup. Items returned to place as they became unnecessary. The house prepared itself for night without instruction. Even discipline shifted subtly. Corrections became rarer because activity itself had slowed. There was less opportunity for disruption. Children did not test boundaries as much because their energy no longer pushed outward. The household rhythm became predictable in a different way, not through repetition of tasks, but through repetition of easing. Evening always softened, night always followed. This predictability reassured children without explanation. Because the environment did not change abruptly, the nervous system did not brace. There was no sharp contrast between activity and rest. Everything moved along a slope rather than over an edge. Adults modeled this transition without intention. They sat more, they spoke less. They handled objects gently. Children mirrored these changes automatically. There was no need to instruct calm. Calm was visible. Evening, then, was not a period to be filled with family interaction. It was a condition that allowed closeness to happen naturally. People were together because they had not been separated. This absence of separation is important. Children were not sent away to prepare for sleep. They were not removed from shared space to regulate their energy. Regulation occurred through proximity and environment, not through control. Because the household had been reliable all day, it remained reliable at night. Children did not fear the transition. Darkness did not signal isolation. It signaled familiarity in a quieter form. Lamplight flickered gently, creating small zones of visibility. Children learned the boundaries of these zones instinctively. They stayed close without being told. Movement stayed within reach of light. As the night deepened, even lamplight became less necessary. People adjusted position to remain comfortable. The house did not need to be illuminated fully. Partial light was enough. Sleep arrived at different times for different children. There was no shared bedtime. One child slept, while another remained awake quietly. This difference did not disrupt the household. It was expected. Adults accommodated these differences without comment. The house did not require uniform behavior. It allowed variation. Sounds continued at a low level. Someone shifting position. A soft voice. An object being set down. These sounds did not wake sleeping children because they were familiar. Familiarity signaled safety. Because sleep occurred within shared space, children did not experience separation anxiety at night. They were not removed from the environment that had held them all day. The same sounds, the same people, the same space remained. This continuity supported deep rest. The body did not need to remain alert for sudden change. Nothing about the environment suggested danger or abandonment. Even when adults eventually slept, the transition was gradual. One by one, movement ceased. Sound thinned further. Darkness increased. No moment announced that the household had gone to sleep. It simply settled. Morning would later emerge from this same environment without shock. Night did not break the rhythm. It completed it. In this way, evening in a Roman family house was not about organizing family life. It was about allowing it to gather gently. There was no need to create time for togetherness. Togetherness was already present. Children learned that closeness did not require attention or activity. It could exist quietly. This lesson stayed with them, shaping how they understood family and security. Evening did not ask children to perform calm. It allowed calm to arrive. It did not demand rest. It made rest possible, because nothing was forced, nothing resisted. The household moved into night the same way it had moved through the day, through small adjustments, repeated daily, within shared space that required no explanation. From this we can see how evening supported family life not by structuring it, but by softening it. The same continuity that had shaped discipline, play and learning now shaped rest. Family life did not pause in the evening. It quieted. And in that quieting, children found sleep not as an instruction, but as a natural response to a world that had gradually asked less and less of them. As evening quieted rather than ended, sleep entered the Roman household without ceremony. There was no threshold to cross, no moment that announced rest as a separate state. Sleep emerged inside the same shared spaces that had held work, play, learning, and conversation throughout the day. The house did not change its function, it changed its intensity. Rest in Roman homes was communal by default. Children slept near adults, adults slept near one another. Space was shared not because of scarcity alone, but because familiarity provided stability. The presence of others did not disturb rest, it supported it. Bodies relaxed more easily when surrounded by known sounds, movements, and breathing. Sleep did not require silence. The household did not attempt to eliminate noise. It allowed it to soften. Footsteps became rare, but not impossible. Someone shifted position. Someone coughed. A voice murmured briefly and then faded. These sounds were not interruptions. They were confirmations that the world remained as expected. Children learned this early. They did not associate sleep with isolation or absence. Falling asleep did not mean being removed from life. It meant remaining within it, but at a lower level of engagement. Familiar sound, did not trigger alertness. It reassured. Shared sleeping spaces meant that waking during the night was normal. A child might stir, open their eyes briefly, sense familiar presence, and settle again without alarm. There was no clock to confirm how long they had slept or how much night remained. Wakefulness did not feel like failure. It was simply another state that passed. Because there was no expectation of uninterrupted sleep, interruptions did not create anxiety. No one measured the quality of rest. The body did not evaluate itself. It rested when it could and resumed resting when conditions allowed. This flexibility made sleep resilient rather than fragile. Adults modeled this relationship with rest. They did not react strongly to brief waking. They adjusted quietly. The household absorbed small disruptions without escalation. Children observed this calm response and learned that night did not need to be controlled in order to be safe. The physical arrangement of sleeping reinforced this stability. Mats, benches, or bedding were placed where they made sense within the space. There was no sharp division between sleeping areas and living areas. The same surfaces that supported sitting during the day supported rest at night. This continuity reduced contrast. The body did not need to adapt to a new environment in order to sleep. Light remained minimal and localized. A lamp might continue burning dimly for a while, then be extinguished when no longer needed. Darkness increased gradually. There was no sudden absence of light. The eye adjusted slowly, awareness followed, temperature shifted gently as well. Stone released the heat it had gathered during the day. Air cooled without shock. Bodies adjusted position instinctively, drawing closer, covering slightly, shifting weight. These movements were not deliberate. They were responses to sensation. Shared space also meant shared rhythms. One person's movement influenced others subtly. When most bodies were still, stillness spread. When one person settled, others followed. The household found equilibrium without instruction. Importantly, shared sleep did not require everyone to be asleep at the same moment. Someone might remain awake quietly while others slept. This wakefulness did not disturb the household. It belonged to the same calm continuum. Silence was not enforced. It emerged naturally as activity thinned. Children learned to sleep through partial sound and movement. This did not harden them, it relaxed them. The nervous system did not learn to expect perfect conditions. It learned to trust stable ones. Familiarity replaced control. Because sleep was embedded in shared life, it did not become an individual performance. Children were not responsible for managing their own rest. They were held within an environment that made rest possible. The burden of sleep did not fall on the child. It was carried by the household. And that changes the feeling of it. When sleep is treated as a task, it creates tension. When it is treated as a response to environment, it unfolds naturally. Roman households leaned toward the latter, not by design, but by repetition. The imperfections of shared sleep were accepted. Noise, movement, brief waking, these were not problems to solve. They were expected elements of night. Because they were expected, they did not escalate. The body did not react defensively. This acceptance supported deep rest over time. Sleep did not need to be protected aggressively. It could be interrupted and resumed without collapsing. The body learned that rest was not fragile. Children carried this lesson forward. They did not associate sleep with anxiety or control. They associated it with familiarity, closeness, and gradual quiet. Falling asleep did not require effort. It required permission, and permission was given by the environment itself. The house played a central role in this process. Its predictability mattered more than its comfort. Walls remained where they were. Sounds behaved as expected. Light diminished gradually. Nothing about the space surprised the body. Predictability allowed vigilance to fade. Even during illness or distress, shared sleep provided reassurance. Presence mattered more than intervention. Being near others allowed the body to settle without explanation. As night deepened, awareness thinned without being forced. Thoughts slowed, attention loosened. The mind did not need to empty itself. It drifted as the environment drifted. Sleep did not arrive because a certain hour had been reached. It arrived because nothing remained that demanded effort. The house had softened enough to allow it, and when morning eventually returned, it would do so through the same shared spaces with the same continuity. Night did not break the rhythm of family life, it completed it. In this way, sleep in Roman homes was communal and imperfect, but stable. It did not rely on silence, separation, or precision. It relied on familiarity, repetition, and shared presence. Sleep arrived because the house softened. This weaving is what defined family life in Roman homes. Childhood did not unfold in isolation, protected from the rhythms of adult life. It unfolded inside them. Children grew among voices, footsteps, tools, bowls, fabric, and stone. They learned not through schedules or explanations, but through repetition and proximity. The house itself taught them what belonged where, how the day moved, and how people adjusted to one another without needing constant instruction. Order did not come from strict control or constant correction. It emerged from rhythm, from doing the same small things in the same shared spaces day after day, from knowing what usually happened next, not because it was enforced, but because it was familiar. This familiarity created security. It allowed children to relax into their environment rather than push against it. It allowed adults to guide without constant intervention. Family life, in this sense, was not organized around ideal conditions. It was organized around real ones. Noise existed, interruptions happened, rest was imperfect. But the environment was stable enough to hold these imperfections without strain. The household absorbed variation without losing its shape. What sustained this system was not silence, precision, or separation. It was continuity. The same spaces that held play also held work. The same rooms that echoed with voices during the day softened into shared rest at night. Nothing needed to be reset, nothing needed to be optimized. Life simply shifted its intensity. Looking back, it becomes clear that Roman family life did not aim for calm by removing complexity. It found calm by allowing complexity to repeat itself gently until it became predictable. Children did not need perfect quiet to feel safe. They needed familiarity, they needed presence, they needed a house that behaved the same way again and again. In Roman homes, family life was not arranged around perfect quiet. It unfolded inside shared space, steady and familiar. Good night.